Welcome to this meeting of the London Transport Museum Friends. We're not, as you'll readily see, in our usual location of the Lecture Theatre at Covent Garden, because as we record this in early June 2020, the museum is sadly still temporarily closed. So the people you see in this video will be talking to you from home, but we hope that we'll be able to stitch it all together so that what you see is a fairly seamless virtual meeting. Our speaker for this session is Andrew Braddock. Andrew had a very distinguished career with both the National Bus Company and with London Transport and Transport for London, but throughout his life has had a passionate interest in public transport, particularly the electronic modes of trolley buses and light rail. Andrew is also passionate about public transport in Europe and indeed European life generally, and the subject of his talk is It Could Only Happen in Belgium. And if you want to know what it is that could only happen in Belgium, well, let's ask Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Well, thank you, Barry, and hello, everyone. I was due to make this presentation in the lecture theatre at the museum in November, so I would have been saying good evening. But given that this is going out via YouTube and you could be tapping into it any time, I'll say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So on with the show. I put this together as a kind of a tribute to the wonderful country that is Belgium and the strange events that can sometimes happen there, certainly in transport terms. It's a small country that sadly we British mostly drive through on the way to somewhere else on the continent, and that's a shame because we should stop. It's famous, of course, for three great things, three of my favourite things in life, it has to be said: beer and chips and chocolates, all three of which would probably explain my waistline if you could see it. But it also, for me, has a fascination because its transport, both historically and in modern terms, is really fascinating. What I'm going to do is take you through the detail of a fabulous event that took place 1st of May last year, to celebrate 150 years of trams in the city. This lovely logo was produced. The Belgians, alongside their colleagues in the Netherlands, are great fans of cartoons and imagery. And you can perhaps see in this slide, kind of through history, the old green tram at the top, the modern silver grey and gold one in the middle, and the kind of 70s through to 90s primrose yellow livery with blue flashes at the bottom. And always present in any image of Brussels, of course, is that famous peeing boy, the mannequin Peace. We'll see him later. That imagery was used extensively in all the publicity for this great event. And in addition, you'll see at the top of this screen, a further logo was created because it wasn't just 150 years of trams in Brussels, but also 30 years of Brussels capital region. In history, Belgium was created almost accidentally in a barber shop after the Battle of Waterloo, a battle site, incidentally, that you used to be able to get to by tram to the south of Brussels until some years ago. And from that point on, Belgium was effectively three provinces, the northern part Flemish-speaking, the southern part French-speaking, having effectively been part of the Netherlands in one case and part of France in the other, and poor old Brussels in the middle. And it didn't really work too well. I should mention that actually Brussels as a region was created in 1991 when Belgium as a country changed its structure. In the old days, if the federal government gave 1 Belgian franc to the Flemish-speaking part of the country, they, by law, had to give 1 Belgian franc to the French-speaking part of the country, and poor old Brussels was somewhere in the middle. So it wasn't really economically viable. So in 1991, regional governments were introduced with much greater powers, local fundraising powers, and certainly significant interest in and control of public transport. There were a lot of very good features about this event, not least the 46-page brochure explaining the whole parade on the 1st of May, of course in 3 languages. Naturally, French on the left, La Parade du Tram, and Tram Parade in Flemish on the right, and the wonderful English version in the middle. There was an excellent leaflet too in 3 languages that explained what was happening on the 1st of May and on subsequent days, because there was almost a week of events built around this 150 years. The map on the right you can hopefully just about see. In the middle is the Place Royale, which was the centre of the event, and where the King of the Belgians came to conduct an official opening the day before, on the 30th of April. And the whole of the street to the south of Place Royale, Rue de Régence, down to the Palais de Justice, was absolutely, both tram tracks, stacked full of the cars that were going to parade through the rest of the route to the north, to Saint-Marie. You can see a kind of triangle at the top, Église Saint-Marie, where they can turn in all directions and back. And the map extends further because it was possible in the afternoon of the parade and on the following Sunday to ride historic trams for free, it has to be said, all the way down to Le Grand at the south of the map and up to the north also at Saint-Marie. So a very, very good event for the public. Lots of information at all the affected stops, because of course some routes were diverted, not just tram but also some bus routes. Everything was explained in the 2 local languages. And even on the information signs, passenger information signs on the metro, for the whole week of the event, there were standard information displays like this to say the parade of historic trams was taking place from 2 o'clock on the 1st of May. The real influencers on the event were the Brussels Transport Museum, Tramway Museum at Woluwe, which is also still an operational tram depot out to the southeast of the city. Wonderful team of people there with a massive number of volunteers who pitch in for all these sorts of events. In fact, all of the cars you can see on that slide sitting outside the museum were moved out for the parade. And indeed, from the inside, a large number of historic vehicles was dragged out at some cost in time, not a little in expense, all with the cooperation of STIB, the transport company. Here is one of the horse buses on its low loader waiting to be taken off to the event. Quite a big piece of kit to do that. And here is the so-called baladeurs horse tram that we'll see later in the parade. Also in the Place Royale, some meter gauge track was laid especially so that Vicinal cars could be displayed. Vicinal was the regional railway company all over Belgium. Absolutely massive network on 3 gauges, most of it meter, some of it standard, and a little bit so-called Cape gauge, 3'6" to us. And those 3 gauges and 3 means of traction, steam, diesel, and electric over many, many years, and of course some horse in the early days. So the SNCV, Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer Vicinaux, had this massive set of lines all over the country, and there were routes on meter gauge radiating from practically every segment of Brussels out to the districts beyond. All sadly now gone, but in at least 2 cases, due now to be rebuilt as standard gauge light rail lines connecting in to the city centre. So this section of track was laid specially to have a steam tram running with the trailer you can see there. On the opposite side of the square, some segments of meter gauge track were put in so that some Vicinal historic cars bought from much further afield than Brussels for the event could also be displayed. Incidentally, it's worth mentioning that of that vast Vicinal network, there are 3 fairly significant segments left. The famous coastal tramway, either side of Ostend, actually the longest tram ride you can make in the world, I think, 69 kilometres from almost the French border to almost the Dutch. There's a network around Charleroi in the Wallonian region of Belgium, which is centred on the so-called light metro concept that came in as part of the old federal arrangements in the 1980s. And last but not least, there's a small line in the glorious Ardennes forest to the Grotte de Han, to the caves. You go to the caves by tram. These used to be all diesel-powered rail cars, and now they're converting them to rechargeable battery. So it's very environmentally friendly. This was the scene on the morning of the parade. Everything lined up, as you can see, down that long stretch of Rue de la Régence with Palais de Justice beyond. Something like 1.25 miles, solidly packed with trams, and lots of visitors fairly early in the morning here coming out to have a look. The parade was led, perhaps somewhat strangely, by a works tram, number 46 you see here. which was actually rebuilt from an old standard 1930s tram car in 1971 by the STB. And it was specially equipped to run at very low speeds, which would normally damage the motors on a standard tram, to carry out track maintenance works. And it eventually received these somewhat eye-catching red and white zebra stripes on its ends to improve visibility in the 1980s. On its side, you can see again this logo of 30 and 150, but also with the tram logo of the Tram Museum. And probably that's why it was in the lead. It was their marker on the event. So first up after that, we have a horse tram. This is number 509, which dates from 1888. As I say, the French would call this a baladeurs. We would call it a toast rack, because that's what it looks like. And of course, the job of the conductor was to walk along those footboards you can see, and he's there in exactly the right uniform for the period in order to take the fares. Notice most of the passengers too have entered into the event in clothing from the period. Interestingly, horse trams are not regularly operated in any city now, apart from one or two special occasions. And it was fortunate that there was one section of track not far from the city centre that was being relayed, so it was possible to run up and down to give the horses a try-out, and so they wouldn't be frightened by traffic. How they coped with all the people gawping at them, I'm not so sure, but they seemed to behave very well. Here we have horse bus number 2, which plied its trade between the two then principal stations in the city, Nord and Midi, or Zuid in Flemish. And those ran for about 30 years. You'll see that in the parade, the driver very cleverly was keeping the wheels of the horse bus away from the tram tracks, so you wouldn't get confused into thinking it was a horse tram. There were many private companies running early horse bus and one or two horse tram services in the city, but they were all eventually consolidated into TB, the tramway Bruxellois. Horse trams are pretty much a rarity these days, although, as probably many people will know, they do still exist on the Isle of Man, in a small German city called Döbeln, and in Victor Harbour in South Australia. There are quite a few in theme parks and Disneylands here and there, but those three, Isle of Man, Döbeln and Victor Harbour, are the only ones where there's regular, at least in the summer, horse tram operation. Next we have number 6. And this is a strange vehicle indeed. If you look behind the horses, just under the front valance of the tram, maybe you can see the 5th wheel. It's operating on 4 road wheels, and the 5th wheel, once the tramways were more prevalent across the centre of the city, could be engaged in the tracks to help with manoeuvring through some of the narrower streets. So quite an interesting vehicle. I'm not sure if that existed anywhere else with that 5th wheel, which in this example is raised, but it could be dropped to engage with the tram rails. So next we have number 830. This is one of the first series of electric trams in the cities, and they were introduced in 1901 by the company TB, Tramway Bruxellois, who used this elegant green livery. They were mainly used in the southern half of the city, and there were several changes made to their appearance over the years, including significant rebuilding in the 1930s. Many of them were then converted to trailer cars, and some ran right into the early 1950s. Here we have number 346. This is a wonderful combination car. You'll see it has an open section and a closed section. And this was the other early tramway company, the Chemin de Fer Économique. And they had a couple of series of these motor cars with the 2 compartments. And they were called California cars because they looked a little bit like the cable cars in San Francisco. The Belgian climate got the better of them, and eventually they were all taken out of service in the 1920s. Here is 346 processing down the main Rue Royale in the parade itself. And I think what's interesting about this shot, health and safety, eat your heart out. Notice that the motorman has got a crowd of people around him, though he has his hands on the power controller and the brake controller. either of which could probably easily be knocked out of his hand by the members of the public sitting there. But interestingly, Brussels folk are very safe, and that would never have happened. Number 984, with trailer 301, is from 1906, and it's perhaps the perfect embodiment of the Belle Epoque style that Brussels was so very fond of. It's a very arty city. For the first time, the driver is standing behind a glass windscreen, but the platforms for the public remained unprotected. Again, there are two interior compartments, but in this case, all with seating backs against the windows. There was first class in one half, which had cushioned seats, and in the other part of the car, it was plain wooden seats. The open trailer 301, again a baladeurs or toast rack, was obviously very enjoyable in the summer months, but not so good in the winter. They had a very low frame to help with passenger flow, and in this case, a single compartment, which was classless. 984 there, with its driver in the uniform of the period. Similarly, 301, the trailer. Notice the conductor's horn. Rather than a bell system, he blew his horn to let the driver know it's time to go. The museum in Brussels has a wonderful touch with matching uniforms to the period of the cars the volunteers are allocated to. 1305 looks fairly similar with trailer 671. But these were a little bit later, from 1910, when the World Fair was held in Brussels on the site of what is now one of the university campus. Once again, two interior compartments, first and second class, very plush velvet cushions in the first, wooden benches in the standard. These cars only lasted until 1932, but many of their underframes were kept and rebodied for additional stock during World War II. 1750 is at the advent of the primrose yellow livery in Brussels, which endured for many, many years. These were designed for the so-called promenade lines, which still operate now, the 39 and the 44, out to the east side of the city on the lovely avenues to Tervuren and to Stockholm. A lot of these cars were modified during the Second World War and even later, and some of them were still operating in 1957. 428 is again one of the Chemin de Fer Économique series of cars from 1903. This time, all one class. So the classless society was coming quite quickly. Next, we have 1348. This was right at the start of the First World War, small series of cars, and really the first ones with the primrose livery, and again the sort of Belle Epoque style. This particular series lasted until the immediate post-war period, when the original PCC cars came along. 5025 is from a series of absolutely wonderful looking Bogie cars, the first really big trams in the city, built for the 1935 World's Fair, when they were expecting to carry very large numbers of people. So here you have a 15-metre tram, 3 to 4 metres longer than all its predecessors. And they were very, very fine cars indeed. Here we see a couple of shots of the sister car, 5008. You can see the size and bulk of the machine, very stylish indeed. 1259 with trailer 2118 is another of the 1930s standard cars, but these ran quite a lot longer, some of them right up to the 1970s. In this particular case, 1259 has been restored to its original condition, and note the box on the front. So these cars generally ran with open trailers until after the war, when they were coupled to closed. 1763, very similar to 1750 that we saw earlier, but again on a classless basis. This one is actually in the condition operated during the Second World War, and you can see the front headlight is masked to avoid problems. 1002 with trailer 102. I'm particularly fond of these because they were still operating when I first went to Brussels in about 1968 or 69. And they were very numerous, this type. You saw them virtually all over the city. And they were the first with the platform doors. Brussels then went into a significant modernization in the early 1950s, adopting the so-called PCC style of tram. PCC stands for President's Conference Committee, which was a consortium of American streetcar operators concerned that they were losing out in competition to the motor car and to some extent to motor buses. What they wanted to do was develop a type of tram which would be capacious, fast, extremely smooth and comfortable to ride in. And that's what came about. There was a lot of research put into it. The American government created an outfit called the Transit Research Corporation, which licensed out other countries to manufacture to the PCC specification. And the Belgian company, BN, La Bourgeoise et Nivelle, built these first standard PCC types for Brussels in the early 1950s. 7047 is 1952 and returned to its original 1952 condition. Notice in this case that the car is operating with a trolley pole. There's a significant trackage of the Brussels network, which can use modern cars with pantographs or historic museum cars with trolley poles, which is quite handy, of course, if you have a big tram museum. Again, the staff are in the exactly correct uniform for 1952. Next, we have 9098. I mentioned earlier that some of the standard car types from the late 1910s, early 1920s had their underframes reused, and this is one such example. The need, of course, in the 1960s to go into one-man operation was something that affected transport operators all over the globe. It was difficult to find two people in a modern labour market to work shifts, and of course it was expensive to have two people on every tram or bus. So the orange board on the corner of this tram, Entrée à l'avant, Ingang Vaux, is announcing that it's front entrance and pay or show a pass in most cases to the driver. These were quite sweet little trams when you see from the offside, short and stumpy, just on the 1-2-axle truck recovered from old cars. So the bodies were much in the PCC style, constructed largely in the tram company's own workshops, and these ran for a significant number of years, but obviously helped to advance cost saving through one-person operation. At the other end of the scale, Brussels was keen to follow the German example of looking at longer articulated cars, where even though you might still have a two-person crew, you were looking at maybe 140 passengers rather than 60, 70 or 80, so a more economic means of transporting large numbers on busy routes. And this car, 7500, affectionately known as Caroline, was constructed in 1962 by the same company, BN, in Bruges or Brugge, because it's part of the Flemish region. It wasn't a huge success because the centre bogies, there are 3 sets of bogies, so it's a so-called 6-axle car. The centre set were unpowered, so it was a little bit limp on some of the hillier sections of route. And this one, as a almost 19.5 metre, I think, single articulated car, remained the only one in the fleet for some years. It was single-ended, whereas the follow-on batches of these cars later were converted to double-end, so they didn't need loops to turn at the end of each route. 4032 was then another example of what you can do with rebuilds. Here you've got effectively 2 2-axle tram underframes with new bodies connected together by articulated joints with a small centre section which is actually suspended by the 2 outer ones. In many parts of the world, these are referred to as 2 rooms and a bath car, for the obvious reason that the outer bits are the rooms and the middle is the bath. Quite a flexible way, again, of extending one-man operation with articulated cars at a point where they weren't too keen on ordering batches of new ones. This type also lasted through till the late 1980s. 1505 is an interesting car. As you'll see, it looks very similar to the many 1920s, 1930s two-axle standard cars, but a batch of these, in fact, the plan was to take 50 of them and rebuild them for use in the first tram tunnels. So instead of the large protruding destination boards almost on the roof of the car that you saw earlier, a destination box of a more modern type has been fitted. The doors have been upgraded. One or two other features have been included so that they could run in tunnels. But sadly, when the plan emerged, as it were, into the daylight, the safety authorities decided they wouldn't allow them to operate in the tunnels because the superstructure of the bodywork is largely wooden construction, and they'd also decided on automated speed control in the new tram tunnels. So the 1500 series, although they operated on surface routes, never actually got into passenger service in the tunnels. These were the cars, the standard type of PCC built from 1951 onwards, that did go into the tunnels. And you'll notice that this car, 7093, is sporting a pantograph at the front, and it does still have its trolley pole at the rear. So when the first east-west tram subway first section was opened in 1969 by the King Baudouin, as he was then, actually drove this car, 7093, into the tunnel on the first day. They were dual equipped for pantograph running in the tunnel sections, and they put the trolley pole up when they went out to the east side of the city to run on the conventional lines. The pre-metro concept, as it was called, really consisted of digging tunnels which were always planned eventually to convert to full metro. So, as you'll see in this example, the stations had two levels of platform. At the back, as it were, of the slide is the high platform section ready to be used when converted to full metro, and you can see the same section on the other side of the track. This is actually at South Station, where there's entrance to the cars on either side. So ground theory was, when you converted to full metro, you simply filled in these low platform sections that were served by the trams. The last batch of PCCs, interestingly, this car 7171 entered passenger service on 7 January 1971, and its bogies came from Johnstown in the United States, where standard PCC cars, albeit to a slightly different gauge, were being scrapped in favour of all-bus networks, as happened in most parts of the States. So this was quite an economic way to get another new batch of cars, 7171, still around today. 7786, having learnt the lessons with Caroline 7500 and the unpowered centre bogie, it was technically possible to power up the centre bogie, and that made it more economical for this type of tram to be bought. And they came in two batches in the early to mid-1970s. There were 128 of them in all. The first batch were actually numbered 75. This car would originally have been 7586 and single-ended, but over time they were rebuilt with doors on both sides. And the second batch in the 7800 series came as double-ended cars in the first place. This car is in the livery adopted from the late 1980s, early 90s, of the silver grey, gold and black, quite distinguished, even more so on new cars. This batch was successful, and in order to provide increased capacity on the very busy north-south tram subway lines, which it is still planned in maybe 2026, I think now, to convert to full metro, a further batch of 61 double articulated PCC cars, the last PCC cars bought for Brussels, came into service in the late 1970s. So for about 30 years, these were the longest trams in the fleet. Again, originally delivered in the primrose yellow and blue, and now in the grey and gold modern strip. There is, by the way, an amusing story relating to royalties paid on PCC car production in Europe and in some other countries, technically to the Transit Research Corporation, which I mentioned earlier, and this eventually was wrapped up in the United States Federal Transit Administration. When the Czechs in Prague were building the last European PCCs in around the early 1990s, obviously the payments ceased, and suddenly there was a flurry of excitement in Washington, D.C. when somebody made the discovery that there was a significant sum of money in the Federal Transit Administration's bank account, and it had clearly come from communists in Czechoslovakia. So you can just imagine the fuss around that. Eventually common sense prevailed, and they found all the paperwork that showed, yes, the loyal Czechs had been right up all through the communist years, been paying royalties on PCC cars they produced. I'm pretty certain that BN stopped paying the royalties after they'd done the last of the 172 four-axle PCCs. And I think both these articulated batches, they kind of argued, were not strictly to the full PCC spec. Next was a one-off batch, the very first low-floor cars to be delivered. They were a bit of an oddball, a special design by BN themselves, unique to Brussels. They weren't operated anywhere else. Here you can see the first one, 2001, being overtaken by the original horse tram. As you'll see, the concept is similar to the 7.9 series, not almost, I suppose, the same length. But you'll notice that the front bogie looks a little bit odd. It has one set of wheels bigger than the others, a so-called maximum traction bogie, and the carrying bogie in the centre was unpowered. So although these were lighter weight cars, they moved around a bit better than the original 7500. These were also the first cars in the city to have leather seats, very distinguished, and now all new trams from this batch onwards came with leather seats. And here we have the next lot, the 3000 series. By this time, the old BN in Bruges has become part of Bombardier. So these are effectively Bombardier Flex City type of trams, similar to the cars operating in Blackpool, Berlin, and many other cities. So the 3000 series are 33 meters long in 5 sections on 6 axles. And one of them was specially painted into a commemorative livery for the 150 years of trams. So you'll see the front section is the chemin de fer économique brown. Then you have the tramway bruxellois green. And then at the back, you have up to the last livery but one of the primrose yellow with blue triangles. There you see it in closer call. One section, of course, has the logo of the Tram Museum on it. So it was really to highlight the 150 years and also advertise the museum. Very good job indeed. That's the centre section, mentioning the 150 years and the website of the Tram Museum. And then the most recent batch of cars have been Flex Cities once again, but in this time 7 sections on 8 axles and 44 meters long, again for the busiest lines in the north-south subways, which are running at frequencies of 2 to 3 minutes in the peaks. This is going to lead to a further batch of new cars that we'll see more of in a moment. Next up in the parade was the conversion from one of the 7.7 series, now numbered 7601 on its own, the Tram Experience. This was a combination of the city of Brussels. A special event unit there was looking at the cuisine of Brussels, and STIB, the tram company, and indeed the Tram Museum, which mans the vehicle, put this together as a restaurant tram based on the success of such things in Melbourne and many other cities. Brussels has its own restaurant tram, so you ride around the city having, I think it's a 6-course meal prepared by Michelin-starred chefs. Quite an experience, an expensive one, but well worth the effort. The remains of the parade was taken up with a whole series of worked cars. 95 is a snow broom. You can see the heavy bristle brushes. underneath the front and rear wheels. It can drive in either direction. Used with the deflectors at the sides there, you can see, to brush snow off the tracks and to brush it out of the grooves in the rails. A very useful vehicle to have in snowy winters. Actually built to an American design. 272 is the next of the works cars in the parade. This one has a side tipping skip for transporting ballast and sand and other equipment needed during track works. So not a particularly glorious role, but nonetheless a very useful vehicle to have, and in the brown colours that were adopted for works cars from the Second World War. Number 7 is another rebuild from an old standard tram, and this one literally is a towing car. So if there's anything in trouble, number 7 can go and tow vehicles. It's also equipped with a whole series of jacks to handle derailments, and notice it's pantograph and trolley pole equipped. So this can run into the subways, and indeed it can even run on the sections that are converted to metro. 16 is the next of the works cars. Again, a very useful thing to have alongside snow sweepers, because this one carries tanks on board with special fluid for de-icing. And again, you can see the brush under the front platform. 33 and 131 is a combination used to transport heavy loads or parts around the depots. It's also equipped, the tanks on the trailer at the back are filled with weed killers to deal with the outer sections of many lines where there's grass track. Number 2 is a works car constructed from a PCC. And this was, I beg your pardon, it looks like a PCC, but it's one of the 5000 series exhibition cars from 1935. And it was rebodied in this fashion in 1957 and then converted to a works car. Again, it's largely used for towing and for moving stores between the depots. You can see the roller shutter side access. 7055, another conversion, this time from a PCC type of tram, and this hauls the trailer with wheel sets. It can carry rails. There's a useful crane on the back section for lifting stuff in and out of work sites. So you'll see this one around wherever there's track works going on. Now we've got some views of the numbers of people in the parade. City of Brussels estimates there were between 70 and 80,000 people for the event. Brussels residents appreciate their trams and they're very happy to come out and celebrate something like this. After the parade was over, there were free rides on historic trams along the route I mentioned earlier. The queues were massive, and you can see here a big lineup of people boarding and waiting to board for their ride around town. The police were in evidence. They're wonderful, the Brussels police, very pro-tram. They were chasing anybody around trying to drive their car down the road, and this pair were supervising crowds on their segways. I think they're copying Amsterdam, where you'll find policemen on rollerblades. Very successful they are too. So segway-mounted policemen controlling tram crowds is quite unique. We saw earlier the section of meter gauge track laid in Place Royale for the steam tram to operate. And there were actually 2 steam tram engines available, so that they didn't have to work too hard between them, because this was shuttling back and forth on this section of track with huge crowds of people right through the event and all 4 days up to the Sunday. So 1066 was one of the steam tram engines and 303 the other. Similar in appearance, but slightly different designs. On the other side of the road, these short sections of meter gauge track were there for a display of old vicinal cars. This was a steam tram trailer converted into a motor car. And then the type from the mid-1930s that were very familiar on all the routes around Brussels. You could go all the way to Leuven on one of these. You could go to the south to Waterloo, to the old battlefield, as I mentioned, and way out to the north and all the way to Ninove in the west. In the 50s, there were quite a number of these N and S type cars all over the Wissel network, but they were very familiar on the final meter gauge routes that operate in Brussels. up until 1978 on the routes out to the north to Grimbergen, Wemmel. And in between here is the type of car that ran on the western routes in the days when the livery was green but still part of the Vicinal Empire. This little car in its works car stripes is a very useful runaround. The museum uses it probably far more than it ever did in its work life. So this was the track gang's fast means of transport to incidents around the network. Also in Place Royale, there was a very good information tent where the iris is the symbol of Brussels, the iris flower. So the 30 years of the city region and the 150 years of trams, with staff from both organisations and from the tram company, a very good bookstall from the Tram Museum, were all incorporated as part of the 150 years exhibition. Also on display was the model, full-scale model of the next generation of trams, which are now on order, the T5000 series, which will start to be delivered later in 2021. So this is it, the 3200 in this case. There will also be some 44-metre long cars, very similar to the existing 3 and 4000 series, with an upgraded, slightly smarter front, I suppose. And again, leather seats in the interior. Alongside it was one of the very first electric cars, so that people could make the comparison. And there was a good display showing through the years from 1869 to 2019 of all the different types of trams and the surroundings that went with them. At the time the 150-year celebration was going on, STIB, MIVB in Flemish, was introducing a new uniform for its staff. And this was a sign at one of the depots asking people, have you got your new STIB, MIVB look? And what always happens when there's a new staff uniform in STIB is that a miniature set is made up to dress the mannequin piece. So here he is in the centre of the old town, proudly wearing his new STIB uniform. This little guy has amassed over the years some 700 sets of clothes, which are kept in 3 or 4 rooms in the old town hall in the glorious Grand Place Market Square. So the mannequin piece in driver's uniform. 150 years of tram was seen as a celebration across Belgium, not just in Brussels, though it happened to be Brussels where the first tram cars ran. And this was a similar event going on in Antwerp, where some old cars were running in passenger service to the museum depot at Groenenhoek. This is an amazing story. This was an operational tram depot and then handed over to the Flemish Transport Museum Society, which looks after it. But there was a significant problem with water leakage from the roof. So the City Council and the Flemish region funded a complete new roof that you can see there. So this is a collection of largely meter gauge old trams from Antwerp on a similar basis to Brussels. At the end of the week, on the Saturday, after the big parade on Wednesday, the 1st of May, the annual European Tram Driver Championship was held. This is a fun event that started about 6 years ago, where drivers from several different cities meet up in one or other. This happened to be Brussels' turn to stage the competition. It's a lot of fun, and the best fun of all is the Skittles competition. So you have to drive the tram to the point where you can hit the large ball, but still stop before you hit the Skittles. And if you're accurate enough, your ball, of course, will knock them all 6 of the pins down. Here's a video of one of the drivers. I think that maybe was a strike. So that was Brussels. I mentioned earlier that Belgium is the kind of country where this kind of thing easily happens. And here's a few tasters for further presentations I'll make later in the year. This was an event to mark 125 years of UITP, Union Internationale des Transports Publics, which is now a worldwide organisation, but started out as the European Tramways Association. So it's a trade body, if you will, of manufacturers, track constructors, and of course the transport operating companies. And UITP invited, knowing it would have the support of STIB and the Brussels Transport Museum, invited companies all over Europe to send old trams to Brussels to operate. And this car from Paris hadn't run since 1937, and yet it performed with a few bits of spitting and troublesome brakes through the day. So this was a wonderful event with, I think, about 8 or 9 cities trams assembled in Brussels to run for 125 years of UITP. Another thing that the Transport Museum in Brussels loves to do is make tours in a trolley bus. Brussels had trolley buses only on one line up until 1964 or 65, and this is one of the vehicles they had. Notice that only one of the trolley poles is on the overhead wire, and you can just see trailing from the back of the vehicle a so-called skate, which is engaging with one of the tram rails to return the current. So this is quite fun to ride around parts of central Brussels in a trolley bus with one pole on the wire and a skate to return the current. And then in the Tram Museum in Antwerp, there is this Gyro Bus. Now, Gyro Buses are really interesting. They only ran in Switzerland, in Belgium, and in what was then the Belgian Congo. So we'll learn more about those on a future event. So thank you very much for looking and listening. And in these strange times, stay safe. I would just like to say a special word of thanks to some good friends of mine who helped with some of the images in this presentation. Barry Lejeune, who you will have heard of, my good friend Robin Orbell, and Christian Scheemakers, who's one of the movers and shakers in the Tram Museum at Brussels. He was very helpful in providing pictures of stuff being moved around before the event.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a really informative and entertaining presentation with some excellent photographs. I was lucky enough to be in Brussels with Andrew and indeed thousands of others for the tram parade in 2019. I guess 2 things really struck me. One was how the event captured the interest of the local population as a whole, not just the public transport enthusiasts. And secondly, in all the effort that must have gone on behind the scenes to make it all happen, just how close a collaboration there was between the current transport operators and the volunteers in the museum. And that, I think, is a very good lesson for us all in London and elsewhere. Andrew, thank you very much for starting this series of virtual meetings in such a splendid way. We are going to have others by Andrew, but some will also invite different speakers to give perspectives, we hope, from around the world. So join us for future virtual meetings of the London Transport Museum Friends, whether you are a friend already or whether you're a potential friend and may wish to join us. Thank you very much indeed.